This is a Trident Disabilities audio archive recording, The City That Fell Off a Cliff by Matthew Green, published April 5th, 2023, read by a Trident Disabilities volunteer. Beneath the waves off the Suffolk coast lies a city taken by the sea through centuries of erosion. Matthew Green revisits Dunwich, a once lively port transfigured into a symbol of loss, both eerie and profound, for generations of artists, poets, and historians drawn to its ruinous shores. Below this is an image containing castle ruins on the edge of a cliff, and it says, "Photograph of All Saints Church, Dunwich, before it went to the waves," from the Nicholas collection of postcards at Dunwich Museum, 1910. And in 1922, finally it fell. It fell amid a waterfall of dead men's bones onto the beach below, the sole surviving tower of a ruined Gothic church, which had teetered for so long off the cliff edge, now overthrown as the sea moved in. Pelvises and thigh bones from the church's graveyard were set into the fallen sods like jelly. Cracked, toothless skulls, too. Their worm-worked eye sockets as gaunt and soulless as the ruins of the beach tower, now just playthings for the waves of the North Sea. The clifftop ruin made a harrowing image, particularly as a jagged silhouette in the twilight, or in the dawn's meadow light. It was much photographed. There was a grim inevitability, but also melancholic beauty, as the cliff face drew nearby, and the church slid even closer to the abyss. So strange to think that the house of God had once been a long way from the cliff edge, in the westernmost part of Dunwich, and shielded from the sight of sailors by a swarm of buildings. As the sea drew uncomfortably close in the mid-18th century, it was declared at a lost cause. By the Victorian period, it lay totally abandoned, and it would be eaten, in tantalizing increments, by the waves. The nave was occupied by bats and owls, and the waters spummed over the cliff at high tide and gnawed away at its base, precipitating until the landslides only a pitiful shard remained. And 3 years later, this too went under, a creeping oblivion so perfectly captured on yellow postcards for their fancy for vanishing worlds. Before it fell, All Saints Church had been one of 3 medieval ruins, 2 of which survived. On a wooded cliff overlooking the North Sea, to the west stands the fragments of a wall and austere, pointed arches of Greyfriars Monastery, projecting palettes of vivid light onto the lonely green fields. Beyond that is what remains of St. James Labour Hospital, built from various masonry salvaged from long-gone buildings, a quilt of loss. The fallen Gothic church was just one of 18 churches, chapels, and monasteries in the vast port of Dunwich. This city was once the same physical size as the city of London with its population, in its late 13th century heyday of around 10,000, before it was savagely diminished by 2 calamitous sea storms in 1288 and 1328, initiating a process of coastal erosion that would plunge much of the city off the cliff in the succeeding sorrowful centuries. Below this is an image of skull and bones buried in the sand and dirt, detailed as a photograph by F. Jenkins, captioned as "Found on Dunwich Cliff" in 1912. All Saints was the last of the 7 parish churches to fall headlong into the waves. The drowned church was doomed to lie in a gully not far out to sea, a habitat for sponges and crabs, and yet it lives on, unvanquishable, for as the story of Britain's lost cities, ghost towns, and vanished villages tell us, what has disappeared beneath the sea can rebuild itself in the mind. At 10 o'clock on a hot August night in 1876, while the rest of the village slept, an illustrator named Charles Keene sat down on the beach of Dunwich, a charming, lonely place, and took out a set of bagpipes to scull away by the sad sea waves for about an hour or so, their blasts vanishing into the sea air. Keene was the cartoonist for Punch, scruffy, depressive, and unusual, a queer spirit as his friends described him. He found that one of the best ways to lift his mood was to play his pipes in the lost city, to strut on the hard sand and skirl away at Fingal's Lament or the Massacre of Glencoe, out of earshot of his soul. He liked to have a good blow on the pipes every day at Dunwich, which was a great solace. For such an uplifting place, some of the sights were decidedly morbid. All along the base of the sandy cliff striped with layers of rolled pebbles, you come upon human bones that have dropped from the shallow alluvial soil at the top. This stark reminder of mortality was strangely cathartic. Keane's friend and fellow Dunwich pilgrim was of the Suffolk poet and translator Edward Fitzgerald, who loved the ruined city's odd, quaint air and used to spend entire summers there with Keane. Most mornings he would stroll along the cliff, wander towards the ruins of Greyfriars, sit down upon the grass, propping himself against the flinty shards of the priory ruins, stare out and write, imagining the monks pacing around the monastery walls, under such sunsets as illuminine still. The drowned city of Dunwich was his elixir of creativity. He was always reluctant to leave. I enjoyed Dunwich so much, Keane wrote in 1864, I can't help talking of next year directly after I leave it. A quarter of a century later, when he was confined to a chair, he went to spend one last cold autumn in Dunwich. 4 months later, he was dead. Below this is two pictures, the first one a closer image of Dunwich from far, off the cliff with the rolling green hills in the background. Charles Samuel Keane, Landscape Dunwich, see to left, 1903. Below this was another image of Dunwich, featuring Waldenwick in the other buried one, from farther away, and it reads Charles Samuel Keane, coast scene near Dunwich, 1855 to 1870. Keane was not the only artist in his twilight drawn to the drowned city. In the final decade of his life, Henry James came to the lost port. He paced up and down the coastal path by the great church in its tall tower, now quite on the verge of the cliff, and stared out to sea. I defy anyone, he wrote in English Hours 1905, at desolate, exquisite Dunwich, to be disappointed in anything. James felt that the minor key is struck here with a felicity that leaves no sigh to be breathed. A month of the place is a real education in the patient, the inner vision. Sadness hung in the air like the salt spray of the sea. A sense of squandered potential pervaded everything and yet, somehow, was uplifting. Keane, Fitzgerald, and James were part of a flock of writers, artists, and poets who made a creative pilgrimage to Dunwich, as artists who seek beauty and decay like to do, whether in Berlin or Detroit or Rome, leaving behind letters, essays, pictures, and diary entries. The famed city, or rather absence of it, in the desperate depth of old Suffolk, put James into a brooding state of mind. Daniel Defoe had been struck at how New Winchelsea, a Sussex port, reduced to a shadow of itself by the recession of the sea, nothing of a town, but of the destruction of it seems to remain. But to James's mind, the sensation was even stronger than when there was virtually nothing left. Dunwich is not even the ghost of its dead self, he wrote. Almost all you can say of it is that it consists of mere letters of its old name. And yet this had once been a city, the main port of Suffolk, with a fleet of its own on the North Sea and a big religious house on the hill. The culprit was the feral sea, or the monster as he later put it. The coast up and down for miles has been for more centuries than I presume to count, gnawed away by the sea. The rest of it, aside from the ruined priory and doomed church of All Saints, was in the North Sea, a ruminating beast, an insatiable, indefatigable lip. By any objective measure, the place was dismal and pathetic, yet it was redeemed, he felt, by the power of sadness. The whole landscape was charged with the sense of mystery, which sounds forever in the heart, straight-tied and hangs through the long, still summer days, and over the low, diked fields and the soft, thick light. Never can the spirit and attitude of the little city submerged be recovered from the depths. In one of the dozen little cottages to which Dunwich had been reduced, James found an old man who could count on his hands until he ran out of fingers. All the acres of land he had seen been absorbed by the sea. He likes to figure that he plowed of old where only the sea plows now. Dunwich was a magnet for dreamers. Something lingered in the air, an era of loss, eerie, profound, and strangely intoxicating. But it was a gentle place to leave or visit. Its violent destruction kept at a safe remove. Victorian visitors to Dunwich did not have to contend with entire parishes crashing into the sea. This had not always been the case. Below this is a picture of 8 to 10 men standing and posing in front of Dunwich. The photograph reads, as a photograph of an unknown group in front of All Saints in Dunwich, around 1904. Much knowledge would be lost about Dunwich if it were not for the extraordinary commission of someone who felt a strong personal attachment to it. John Day, destined to become one of the most prolific and prestigious publishers of the Reformation, was, in all likelihood, born in the parish of St. Peter's, Dunwich, in 1522. Growing up, he would have had a view of the central market square, and beyond the townhouses, shops, and market sheds, the tower of the beleaguered church of St. John's. The neighboring parish had been fighting a desperate battle to keep the sea at bay. Its church was teetering on the brink of a cliff edge, and with just a tiny bit more erosion, the base of the cliff would be undermined, and the church would plunge into the sea. In 1544, its defenses were bolstered, but the church fell anyway and joined the ghost churches beneath the waves. For the next 2 years, when Day made the short walk to purchase a new sword blade, doublet, hot sheep's foot, beef pie, or, for that matter, a book, the 22-year-old was treated to a dramatic experience. Many of the various stalls and shops in the center of the marketplace were now staring straight into the abyss, and humans' bones and children's coffins poked out from what was left in the graveyard. Through the casement windows of his parlor, Day may even have been able to see straight off the cliff. Understandably, he did not remain in Dunwich for much longer, going to seek his fortune in London. But like so many, he retained a lifelong fascination with the perilous city on the cliff, leaving a bequest for a statue in St. Peter's Church, which by the time of his death would barely exist at all. While he was establishing himself in London, thumping and hammering and squelching out stories of Protestants cruelly tortured and killed at the hands of Catholics, his home city continued to be oppressed by its own tormentor, the sea. By the time Elizabeth I acceded to the throne, Dunwich was even further diminished. The advancing cliff line by then had capsized around 3/5 of the medieval city. The parishes of St. Leonard's, St. Michael's, St. Bartholomew's, St. Martin's, and the upmarket St. Nicholas's had been plowed off by face into the waves below. Dunwich's former economic prosperity was in short supply. Most of the wealthy elite had long since fled. The flourishing shipyards that Henry VIII had impressed to Woolwich had never returned. And as the shingle bar drifted further south, it thinned the mouth of the Blythe River, limiting across the haven. This benefited Dunwich's competitors. The dissolution of the monasteries, furthermore, along with a dramatically reduced population, led to diminution in demand for fish. The fishing fleet, ever a source of prosperity, dwindled accordingly. Below this is an image of 8 to 10 men pulling and struggling to haul a boat to sea, or away from the sea, as a wave is about to crash over them, in the shape of Dunwich. Dunwich wasn't a completely lost cause, not yet. Wealthy Londoners bought up disheveled, monastuck land, and healthy numbers of people left bequests to Dunwich's church, an odd thing to do if everyone accepted they were not long for this world. But more destruction was to come. Candlemas each February was a festival to commemorate the Virgin Mary by lighting candles in churches across the land. They did not stay lit in Dunwich for long. On February 5th, 1570, the sea rose up with an unabated fury for the Candlemas storm. Many feet of snowfall suddenly thawed on Candlemas Day, triggering a terrible flood that coincided, as luck would have it, with another sea storm. There was a great rage of water that ripped houses to pieces, turning roof beams into battering rams, demolishing stone walls and buildings, uprooting pews from churches, and propulsing people backwards off the cliff in the middle of the night as they slept. The more the city disappeared into the sea, the more it grew in the popular imagination, as lost cities are invariably blank canvases onto which we project, empty spaces of the mind that quickly fill with present-day concerns. Myths were born, exacerbated by a lack of information from Dunwich itself, as the trade links with London and other ports dried up, portraying the ancient city as a veritable Anglo-Saxon metropolis to rival London. As a major player in the book trade and a voracious reader himself, Dunwich-born Day knew exactly what kind of books that piqued the imaginations of the elite. In the investigative spirit of the Renaissance, there was an appetite for understanding history anew, for cutting an empirical reality instead of mindlessly regurgitating received knowledge. The idea of getting to the truth of his birthplace seemed to have proved irresistible today. He knew one of the most esteemed and able topographers historians in the country, John Stow, who had published a series of chronicles of English history and who would later famously map the capital in vivid detail. A long letter, overwhelmingly attributed to Stow, survives from 1573, 3 years later after the Candlemas storm, and is addressed to one Master Day. We knew that Dunwick whet his curiosity in the General Chronicle of England, an edition of which was published in 1615. He describes Dunwick, an ancient city in Suffolk, now decayed and supposedly more than half swallowed up by the sea. He goes on to outline the various myths, but says these are easily disproved by manifest and sound record, which I have seen. He states elsewhere that the ancient splendor of Dunwick excited my curiosity of visiting, and his faculties as a researcher meant that he was ideally placed to critically examine the legendary semi-submerged city. It seems that the bookseller Day sent the Chronicle Stow on an investigative mission. He would see the city firsthand and go through the borough records, examining many documents that have since been lost in his quest to establish the truth. I beheld the remains of the rampart, some token of Middlegate, recalled Stow in an evocative passage, the foundations of downfallen edifices, and tottering fragments of noble structures, remains of the dead exposed, and naked wills, divested of the ground about them by the waves of the sea. He also found there diverse coins, several mill hills, and part of an old quay. Day had some specific questions in mind, which he submitted to Stow in advance. What was the physical extent of Dunwick now and in old times past? What proportion of the original city survived, and how much had sunk? How many churches did Dunwick have of old? What of the religious houses, hospitals, chapels, and leper colonies? How many gates had been there? Was there ever, as frequently claimed, a mint or a castle? How many people lived there? Had it actually been a city or just a big town? Below this is an image of 9 different types of seals, with the middle one being a boat, and the top 3 also containing boats, with others including images of people and preachers and crowns including on them. The description for this says, Plate of seals found at Dunwick, from Alfred Suckling, The History and Antiquities of the County of Suffolk, 1846. Stow dealt with these forensically. The town was 200 acres within its bounds, and from the quay in the north to the southern limits of Palestike, 1 mile in length and 1/4 of a mile from Middlegate in the west to the cliff of the east, Stow deduced that if Dunwick had been built like other historical cities, then it would have been once as wide as it is now long, a square mile. This meant that either 2/3 or 3/4 of the original city was drowned. He does concede, however, that it is gathered and conjectured for want of surviving sources. Something Stow says seemed to feel uncomfortable entertaining, being flatly contradicted by his first-hand observation, is the common fame and report of a great number of credible persons that Dunwick in its prime, around the year 1250, had no less than 70 parish churches, religious houses, hospitals, and chapels, along with a like of number of ships and even windmills. This myth would die hard. W. G. Sebald leaves a masterful account of the destruction wrought at Dunwick in the Rings of Saturn, 1998, after the storm of January 1328. When dawn came, the throng of survivors, numbering some 2,000 or 3,000, stood on the edge of the abyss, leaning into the wind, gazing in horror through the clouds of salt spray into the depths where barrels and barrels, shattered cranes, torn sails of windmills, chests and tables, crates and feather beds, firewood, straw, and drowned livestock were revolving in a whirlpool of whitish-brown waters. Yet even such a preternaturally talented writer as Sebald also perpetrates myths. Despite writing of more than 50 churches, monasteries, and convents and hospitals, the real number of ecclesiastical buildings after 1066 was 18, and his list of parish churches, that one after the other, toppled down the steadily receding cliff face and sank into the depth. He includes structures that never existed. Made at around the same time in Stow's survey is an arresting map of half-drowned Dunwick. The land surveyor and cartographer Ralph Agass from Suffolk mapped Dunwick and its environs for the first time in 1589. Engraved on fine parchment, made from the skin of a calf, Agass's map was part of his failed project to reform and revive the port, whose blockage by the drifting shingle bar had led to such a catastrophic loss of trade. The original map does not survive, but it was copied into Thomas Gardner's 18th century history of Dunwick. and we see a shadow of the city in its high medieval prime before the terrible events of 1288. This was a cartographer rather than a diver, and so he could only map what was left, a mere fraction of the original city. However, he does provide a very clear picture of the remaining quarter. The positions of the roads and street as they are abruptly cut off by the sea have allowed historians to interpolate where those streets may have led in the earlier city. Below this is a hand-drawn map of what was left by Dunwich by the 16th century. It is likely based on Ralph Agassiz' 1580s map itself or Joshua Kirby's copy of Agassiz' map for Thomas Gardner's An Historical Account of Dunwich, 1753. All Saints is visible in the middle, at a fair distance from the sea. In the decades following Stowe and Agassiz' representation, Dunwich's predicament became even bleaker, and most artisans left for neighboring towns, cities, and villages, as the merchants had already done. Many of the remainder were impoverished and malnourished, living off the sea peas that grew around town. In the 17th century, the fishing trade with Iceland dried up, and the herring trade in waters closer to home diminished considerably. Countless efforts to revive the port came to nil. As the coastline threatened to sweep further in, people began to move inland into new brick-built houses. As ever in the history of vanishing places, there were some stubborn or perhaps overly optimistic souls. In 1631, one Robert Bennett of Westhall signed an ambitious 500-year lease on various houses in St. Francis's Meadow, houses that would plummet over the cliff face before even a fifth of that time was up. The surviving churches degenerated, along with their parishes. All Saints, impoverished by the beat of the sea, and decayed St. Peter's, according to the spiritual report in 1652, suffered outbreaks of witchcraft. Eliza Southern claimed that the devil himself had assumed the form of a crab, snuck into her bed, bitten her, and then forced her to sign away her soul in blood for 14 years. The population continued to fall. The Hearth tax returns of 1674 showed only 114 fireplaces, 19 of which were in houses that lay empty. And then one night in 1677, another ruinous storm came. Waves rolled over the marketplace. The market cross with its shelter for stalls was taken down, and all the tradesmen and women began to seek new venues further inland. All the houses north of Mason Dew Lane were destroyed. In 1688, the east end of St. Peter's Church collapsed, and not long after its bells were removed, the final pitiful chunk plunged off the cliff. The church where John Day had been born, now architecture for the crabs, an inspiration for windswept promeneurs some centuries later. Below this is a map showing mostly the sea and ocean, with a small cliffside showing Dunwich. And following this is an image of the last part of All Saints Church on the Dunwich coast in 1919, nearly falling off. The skies were heavy, the sea slow. I wandered away from the cliff edge, though the lifeless village which I was unable to connect with old Dunwich in a meaningful way, towards the remains of Greyfriars. The priory spread its wings through a lonely cold meadow. Ruins are time and abeyance. They are at once of their time, yet the remnants of it too, bringing the fragility of the present into stark focus. They also portend how our civilizations may end up in the future. As I wandered, aesthetics demanded that the ruined nave and fallen arches should be windswept, but they were not. They just stood there, looking at what was left of the walls, now standing so vulnerably in this field like a domino. It was hard not to contrast this fragile ruin with its earlier purpose. It was once a refectory, where the monks gathered to eat fish from Iceland and wine from Gascony by the light of the flame, a rare break from the symphonies of silent prayer, now just a heap of stones in the field. I walked away from the field with its ruins, opened a gate through an ugly mesh wire fence, and followed a footpath into a little wood where the trees were feral and wispy. In the distance, I could see a stone bridge, and beyond that, the sea. Before the coast swept in, this was a Middlegate Street, which itself gave way to Duck Street, which in turn curved left up to the marketplace, eventually opening onto the mouth of the port. It would have been a track busy with carts, riders, litigants, come to attend one of the courts, and flocks of geese and duck and other livestock for sale in the meat market. The only place it led to now was the cliff edge, my destination. I looked out to the sea, tracing what I imagined to be an area half a mile out. The waters were gray and quivering, and it was silent. None of Dunwick's churches rang their bells from the deep. The sense of emptiness is haunting and overpowering. There is a presence in which is missing, writes James. There is our history in there being so little. One need only stare out to the site of medieval Dunwick to understand that in its absence can have more presence than what is actually there. How many of our own settlements are going to end up this way, I wondered, eaten by the sea. But I was sidetracked by one of the most poignant sights I've seen so far. It was the last surviving gravestone from a churchyard of All Saints. The gravestone rose like a dead tooth from the barren earth, beneath low-hanging branches. The inscription reads, "In memory of Jacob Forster, who departed his life March 12, 1796, aged 38 years. He was exactly my age. Soon he too will fall to the sea.